Okay, great.
Okay, so let's start. Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Frank Spillers. Thank you for joining us to offer this session about inclusive design. Frank is the founder of Experience Dynamics. Frank, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Maha. Thanks everyone. Welcome to Inclusive Design, and it's discovering opportunity beyond bias. So in this webinar, we're going to be talking about inclusive design and what that means and how you can change some of the things you're doing to gain more opportunities for your product. Before we get started, let's do a little poll here for some fun. If you go to slido.com and put in this 259157, and the question is just simply, what's your area of study or business venture? I see some of you already have some answers going there. So while that poll is going, I'll maybe give you a little bit of introduction to myself. I'm the founder of Experience Dynamics, and Experience Dynamics is a user experience consulting firm. We've been in business for 20 years and been working with organizations around the world. And I'm also a trainer, and I teach with Interaction Design Foundation privately with Experience Dynamics, and then I also have a kind of mentoring community called uxinnercircle.com. But I started out in this field actually in the mid 1990s with virtual reality, and studied in the UK and then moved to Silicon Valley and Southern California and studied human-centered design there. If you're looking for that number, it's 259157, and it's at slido.com. Back up on the screen there. And it looks like, yeah, so education, IT, marketing, renewable energy, energy efficiency, special education, surgical devices, dog food supplements, AI and ophthalmology, computer science, IT, marketing. So a real range there, a real range of welcome those of you joining, and so nice to see you, so nice to be here with you. Today we're talking about inclusive design and what does that mean? So the topics that I wanted to cover today include what inclusive design is. So I want you to go away from this session with an understanding of inclusive design, and also how to start to use inclusive design and how to avoid bias and exclusion and really what amounts to lost opportunities. And then also we're going to talk about some practices for building inclusion into your product or service development. On the right-hand side there, there's an avatar selector from a VR type of experience. And, you know, I don't know if this is the one that I was trying to bring up, but I was trying to bring up the Alchemy Labs. Alchemy Labs is the company that Google bought. They spend a lot of time creating an inclusive avatar selector, and avatar selection is kind of a good example of thinking about inclusive design, because it's different body types, different race, obviously different gender, but different maybe expressions of identity. So it's a nice kind of reminder, basically a way of thinking about inclusive design from that kind of VR perspective. So let's get started then. Why inclusive design is critical for product success. And just to start out by saying that inclusive design is something that's fairly new. If you're new to inclusive design, that's okay. Even in the United States, we're really only talking about like the last couple of years, even in the last year, being going from uh, not just thinking about who's excluded and who's left out of a conversation or of a policy or a product, but in the last maybe 5 years, it's been growing in the U.S., but I would really say in the last couple of years, actually, quite honestly, and even within the corporate sector. So there are a lot of organizations trying to figure out, but the thing that's for sure is that there's no going back to exclusion. There's no, this is not just a repeat of in the United States, the civil rights movement led to legislation for equality. We don't have gender equality in the United States yet. They made an attempt in the late 70s and then the government killed it. We have equality for disability rights since the 1980s, but when it came to digital by the year 2000, it was very like not quite. It's on the law, but it's each state can decide whether they want to. It's like a voluntary observation of the law instead of a mandatory for all states. Uh, and it's only since the mid 2000s that gay rights in the United States started to become, first in the military and then with Obama and then became more societal. And it's really only in the last like 5 years that transgender rights, for example. But what's happened in the United States and the rest of the world, but in the United States, this is a very, very, very serious topic, is inclusion, right? So that's the kind of context I think of inclusion. And one of the things with the United States is it's a colonial settler society, so it doesn't really realize that. People in America don't really realize they're a former British colony, but what's happening is the culture is changing and shifting now. And it's time, I think, for the rest of the world as well to leave the vestiges of colonial influences, because all the racism in the world really comes from colonization and colonialism. I have a background in history, actually, so it's really easy for me to see this. But when you were at school, if someone didn't invite you to a birthday party, I mean, that's what exclusion is. So we're talking about inclusion, right? Airbags in cars were actually fitted for they were sized from the body proportions of men. And this is a female mannequin of a crash dummy, but all the crash dummy testing in the car industry has been with a male body size, and a female body size is very different. So that's only a new thing. 2 years ago, this astronaut Christina Koch was supposed to be part of an all women's spacewalk, and they canceled her at the last minute because they ran out of spacesuits for women. They were short on them, and they said it was just a technical, just some type of shortage of spacesuits problem. And later on in the year, she was able to do the spacewalk, but for that particular mission, which would have been an all-female spacewalk mission, she was not able to go. And the point of this is that, bias is everywhere. And it's just like the colonial settler states, Israel, the United States, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. These cultures have very strong legacies because the bias of those cultures that came there brought their biases to those societies. And sometimes it's hard for them to see, those biases. But it's the exact same thing with men and women. Men are used to a man's world. We're only talking, not too many hundreds of years ago where women were essentially slaves or kept as slaves. you know, and going back to ancient history, for sure. But even in the United States, we're talking about slavery only being, you know, was existing like 100, 120, 130, 140 years ago or so. So uh, we've had a legacy of untangling, and men don't understand what life is like for women. You know, that it's a very different world. It's a very different walk in the street for a woman than it is for a man, and men are completely clueless. So we operate out of our biases. This last picture, by the way, is there's actually research that's done that shows that buildings, office spaces, are cooled to a temperature or heated to a temperature that's more comfortable. It's designed around the default of men. That women actually prefer like 5 degrees warmer, I think, space, and women are always cold in spaces, apparently, like in office spaces. There's like studies done on this, you know. And it's just like a reminder that biases are everywhere, you know. Um, the question is, who are we talking about in terms of exclusion? And we're talking about people of color or the minority population in your country, the minority that's not in power, if you know, because in some places where there that are leftover colonialism, for example, in Rwanda, the British put the minority into power, and then they kind of like slaughtered the majority, the Hutsi and the Tutsi. Um, we're talking about people of a lower socioeconomic status. You know, we tend to, in American corporate studies, we tend to sort of leave those people out by selecting income group. So we choose an income group, and we say, well, you know, this product is for people that have money, and it's, you know, the danger of just making things for people who have money is the people who have money can just buy anything. So why should they buy your product? And so their loyalty tends to be less, you know, people that maybe have a little bit less money tend to, if they value your product and your product or service has a very strong attraction, they're more likely to be fans of it. We're talking about the elderly population. We're moving into the next like 20 years, even 10 years or so, we're moving into a increase globally of an aging population. In the United States, we're talking about a majority Latinx or Hispanic population. People from Latin America are going to be the majority. They already are in California and places like that. And we're talking about people with disabilities. Or, you know, we think about disability, we think about the person in the wheelchair. Well, it's not just mobility. There are other disabilities, for example, blindness or low vision. So that's what I mean by the other disability. Or there are invisible disabilities. You know, I just saw a sticker yesterday in a cafe that said, not all disabilities are visible. And so invisible disabilities are like ADHD or ADD or autism spectrum. They're also people who don't want to say they have a disability would be an invisible kind of disability because they don't want to be stigmatized, so they won't say, so you won't see it, you know. LGBTQ plus population, classically excluded, you know, depending on the rights in your country. And then people in rural communities, so we tend to take city-centric bias, right, where we design things for the city, even though it might be used also in the country or in smaller towns or villages. And then there's the cross-cultural angle, which is, you know, customers in other countries. We tend to design things for our comfort zones. Just that's what we do as human beings, whatever it is. We design things for ourselves. But that's like really bad design because the intelligent designers in the last 100 years, at least, you know, when we have consumer items and goods and things like that, they all study their population. They all fit their products and interfaces to their actual, you know, humans. So today I'll talk a little bit about human-centered design, which is where we draw from. But really, we're talking about underrepresentation here. You know, people that are powerless, they're perceived to be unproductive, like the aging population. You're old, so you're no longer, you know, or stigmatized, you know, terrible stigma, especially depending on what culture you're in. You know, in some cultures, people with disabilities are beaten and raped. Women are raped because of their, you know, just they're disabled. I was speaking to a user in Zimbabwe, an organization that goes out and they find women on Twitter and they go to the village and they say, look, you have rights, we can represent you, you know. And the people in the village don't even know that, or the women are being abused because they're being beaten up just because they have a disability. So we're talking about, you know, we're talking about reaching underrepresented groups, and we're also talking about JEDI, or what's typically called DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the J is standing for justice. So what does justice mean? Justice means historical justice. So if your population was abused, you know, you think of in your region, think about Palestinians, you know, they have a lot of J there, in the sense of being historically abused and marginalized and militarized and sort of kept in concentration camps, you know, in the Bantustans in the same way South African government did. But in the United States, this means understanding and recognizing the fact that, you know, African Americans come from America's tradition of slavery, you know, which was how the British Empire, you know, took over from the Spanish Empire. They used piracy and they used slavery. You know, Christopher Columbus was a slaver. Actually, we celebrate Columbus Day in the United States, but we're celebrating the day of a slaver. He made his money through slavery. All the great pirates that the British Empire ran. I just read a book about the British Empire and piracy. The United States was founded on piracy, essentially, on stealing and thieving and murder and stuff. So, you know, and black people were brought over by the pirates, actually. It was the pirates that brought the black people to America. So this, when we're talking about justice, we're talking about that historical justice. And for women, for example, we're talking about justice, for example, in the workplace. You know, it's ridiculous in the United States we don't have equality for women. You see, all this, like the DEI, the diversity, equity, inclusion, this has been like talked about for the last 40, 50 years, right? It's since the 1980s in the US. I don't know in Lebanon how, you know, how this fits in, but you have your own cultural unique conditions. Equity is not equality, right? Equality means it's equal, one person equal to another. Equity means actually there's there is you know, sort of justice given to that group. In other words, that they actually are you know, their rights are pursued through the need that they have as a marginalized group or underrepresented group. Diversity, you know what that is, right? So that's like including difference, and of course inclusion is the act of including. You think about like facial recognition. This is a the UK police facial recognition software, and a lot of this is coming from the AI cameras, the AI enabled cameras that have facial recognition. But if your product has anything to do with facial recognition, you're already in a dangerous water, because of the fact that you know, it can be abused, or anything to do with vision. Like, this is the wonderful advance in computer science, is machine learning and vision, and with you know, cameras, essentially cameras everywhere. But it's caused so many problems that in the United States there are many cities that have banned the use of police using AI and cameras to detect populations. And the reason was because of the riots last year. Like, most of the US was burning in 2020, was burning to the ground. Like, cities, just riots. Like, for in Portland there were riots for 5 to 8 months last year. Maybe reported in the news for like 2 to 3 weeks or a couple days or maybe a month or two, but the riots were going on every night. So inclusion starts with teams. You know, diversity is critical, especially when you're designing for ethics, you know, that you bring a cognitive diversity. So for example, if you have all men designing software and your product is probably used 50% by women, it's going to bring a lot of male biases to it, you know? And the same for any you know, lens that you bring or don't bring. Why is diversity important? Well, there was this Harvard Business Review quoted a nice study that was done over here with 1,800 professionals, 40 case studies. They found two kinds of diversity: inherent and acquired. Inherent is, your traits, like what you're born with, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation. And acquired is traits that you gain from your experiences, cultural differences, that maybe you had. For example, I was born in Zambia in Africa and lived there for the first 7 years of my life. It definitely left an impact on me. And it was great actually, because I was in the minority. I remember that, as a white person, I was in the minority. It was great. I loved it. Um, and other experiences that you may have, but you look at this is what they call 2D. So these two dimensions here are 45% likelier to report a growth in market share over the previous year, and 70% likelier than the firm to than for the ability to capture a new market, essentially. So it's the freshness, I guess, of basically the underpinning to this research is that if you narrow your lens and if you don't have inclusion in what you're doing, you're going to, maybe not intentionally, but you're going to bring bias to your design and business decisions. And in a world that's becoming more multiracial, multicultural, global, cross-cultural, there's just no place for it, right? Very practically, I mean, I worked with a client a few years ago. They had their software is for children, and they evaluate children with like software. The language they only supported was English, and you have in some school districts, like in Florida, in Orlando, Florida, you have 150 languages spoken in one school district. So Spanish being like one of the dominant languages. And for them, that was a big problem. Now, today, they have bilingual 5 years later. Also, their software was not accessible. So what did that mean? It meant that people with disabilities were not able to use their assistive technology to find it, to access the software. And the the problem with that was they weren't able to sell the software because they're a not-for-profit. They're essentially making money selling software to the school districts. So even though the schools are public in the U.S., you can sell software to them, right? So they were selling the software, but the school districts won't buy it if it's not accessible, because the school districts are held to federal or to national government rules, and that includes the Disability Rights Act of the 1980s, the American Disability Rights Act. So it basically means you can't sell your software, right? So I think it's the same with sustainability. Like if you try and sell your product into the European Union, or now in the US, which has just passed this sweeping, or is about to pass this sweeping legislation for sustainability, it's going to be more difficult. So it's just you end up like niching, putting your software in a niche or your product in a niche if you're not inclusive. So really, we're talking about a hidden innovation here, right? You think about localization. This is Google Tez on the right here. They actually just call it Google Wallet now, but Google Tez was designed with a cross-cultural perspective and actually the dominant mobile payment system is Paytm in India, but for moving money from instantly from bank to bank, this app was the biggest, had a high adoption. And this is what's interesting, is that Google Pay is not Google's mobile payment has no adoption in the US, zero. Like I think it's like 1%, maybe 2%. Apple has maybe about 22% maybe now. And so why is that? Why is it that Google can't they invented Google Pay, but when they went to India, what they did, it's interesting. They went and studied the cultural conditions. They made it fit the culture so this is with localization, most people think it's a translation thing. But actually, you need to do cross-cultural design. You need to do cultural sensitivity. And localization is weak because experts are in short supply. Multiculturalism is difficult. Especially American teams find it very difficult. America is a culture that is not like, it is multicultural in reality, but it's not. People don't think multiculturally in the United States. People don't speak different languages. They don't travel. They're not subject. So for them, when a different population comes in, like from Latin America, it's seen as like a problem, as a threat, or something strange that they just, so you really see this Microsoft over the years just struggling to localization. I was doing a study for Microsoft. I was in London, just outside of London, in Reading, some years ago, and Microsoft's internal people were complaining that the software was in the American date system, month, day, year, day, month, year, that even just that small, it's a classic known localization thing, that dates and weights and measurements, they're all different in the UK than they are in the US, but even Microsoft's internal people were not able to. So, it's the big bias, that not a lot of people talk about, that we think our culture is the one that's right because we're familiar with it. That ethnocentrism governs most people's perspectives, and a lot of localization is just stereotypes or outdated or improperly contexted insights, unfortunately. So I know some of the startups that are listening today are doing localization. It's so important. Edward T. Hall, he's one of the best American anthropologists, and in his book Beyond Culture, he said that the problem here is you can't describe a culture from the inside or from the outside without referencing the other, and the question of inside and out is really what we're talking about with inclusive design. So there's this idea of in-group and out-group, so like someone who's accepted and someone who's not. Getting out of the building, why is that so important? Because that's how we activate empathy, that how designers and devs think about users and how users think about their problems, usually very, very different. That's where the money is right there. If you're looking for the money in the conversation today, that's where the money is right there on this one right here. That if you can figure out how your users define the problem, it's going to be where your profit is, So I seem to be inadvertently activating, I don't know what I did, subtitles or something. So your company versus your culture company. I talked about men versus women. So even if you're not doing localization, you versus your users, there's a cultural divide there because you're university educated, you've been thinking about your problem, you understand maybe how to code, et cetera, et cetera. Your users or patients or whoever it is, constituents, like whoever the audience is, they're in their culture, meaning their rules, the way they think about the problem, the way they go about their business with your product or your interface. So there's a barrier here of empathy that we have to jump through when we do inclusive design for even with people with disabilities. It's a huge one. The stigma. I even noticed in my own. I've been doing work with people with disabilities with accessibility for close to 20 years actually, and I've been actually more like 25 years, but in digital accessibility close to 20 years, and so this is really interesting. Somehow I accidentally activated subtitles, which would be for deaf and hard of hearing people. And it says subtitles aren't available right now because the speaking voice is too quiet. I don't know. I'm using like an American speaking voice, which is pretty loud, I think. So that's an example there of, there's subtitles or captioning built in to the software, but I didn't intend to turn it on, but I accidentally turned it on while we're speaking, and it won't let us. It won't let us. I like to use the football pitch analogy of understanding your users. And there's three options here of, where are you outside in? I've been doing localization work for close to 20 years as well, like in my consulting work. And I've been working, globally, doing global user research. And the question is like, are you outside the football pitch? Are you in the ring, or are you on the grass? And what I mean by this analogy is, where do you put yourself in your mind, right? So if you're designing for pregnant women, if you're designing for a refugee, or you're designing for someone in another country, where do you put yourself in terms of your strategy? Do you stay where you are? Are you outside the football pitch? Are you just sitting in the seats, like looking at the game? We call it the peanut gallery, which you just kind of sitting there just eating your peanuts. Or are you down in the grass? Because it's really easy to crack open culture. I've found studying culture, I used to think it was a complicated thing. Most people think it's really complicated. Actually just requires a willingness and an openness and a curiosity. And every time I interview a user with a disability, I learn so much. I'm like, my God, I've learned so much in this, and I would say that even just for users, every time I interview a user, I learned so much. Are you outside or inside? With disability, a lot of people are outside because they're like, oh my God, I don't know what this is. I'm not sure how to act. I don't know what to say. Am I using the right language? We have a legacy of, I alluded to this before, of colonialism, racism, and intolerance, basically. If you look at ethnography, which is where this is where we gather our user research from, by the way. We don't do focus groups in UX. We don't really use surveys as a primary tool. Focus groups are a market research technique. They're good for maybe identifying what it is you're trying to identify, but to really get onto that football pitch, you have to live with your users. Ethnographos, it's a Greek word, means culture study, ethnography. And the early ethnographers were about creating separation. They would go into, because it was colonialism, we're talking like 1870s, 1860s, 70s, or I'd say like 1800s to like the 1850s. And they would say like, oh my God, look at these natives. They don't love God. They're heathens. And they come up with all kinds of reasons to, and what it was the British Empire was trying to establish that white people, British people, were superior somehow racially and all this. And this is America up to the 1920s, by the way. American society is actually had these. If you were Irish, for example, they said you were descendant from an ape. And so a lot of Irish people went into the police force in New York City. And about 20 years later, somehow they evolved, their brain evolved, because they quieted down, they stopped drinking, they came into the police, and they became respectable as a ethnicity in New York City in that place. So that changed, by the way, with ethnography. By the late 1800s, ethnographers were more like, let's go live with our people, and so we can understand them. Right. And this is, and there's a couple words today so one of them is called positionality. The other one is called getting proximate. But positionality, to begin with, means that where you're coming from will influence how you understand the world. Right. But in time and space, for example, but it's also not something that you're stuck with. You're not born with. It's just a bias that you bring because it's what was familiar with you. If you grew up in the streets, that's what's familiar to you. If you grew up in the suburbs, or were driven around in a Rolls Royce, that's what's familiar to you, and so forth and so on. And so this is how bias creeps in, because we project our familiarity. So I want to do a little exercise with you here. Maybe if you can take a screenshot of this right now, if you're still with us. I'll also leave it up on the screen, but what I'm going to do is break you into groups, and this is just an exercise. It says your team, obviously. With the people that will be in your breakout room, there'll just be a handful of people in your breakout room, maybe 5 or 6 people, and just to go down each one of these and rate. So the rating is a scale of 1 to 10, and so for example, if you look at your marriage status, 1 is single, 10 is married, again. So you can rate yourself where you land on that and kind of place a position here. on the chart. So that's and the idea here is that when we do inclusive design, we actually want to start with disclosing where we're coming from in a team. Like what, in other words, because that's where we then realize where our weak spots are, where our lack of diversity is, you know, in terms of our thinking, and our cognitive diversity is affected by our background, where, you know, our previous experiences. So if you got a screenshot of that, that's good. And now going to drop you into some breakout sessions for 5 minutes where you can discuss with other people that you have there. So here we go. It's going to be 5 minutes. You'll be taken to a room with like 4, 5, 6 other people, and we'll come back in 5 minutes. Does anybody have any questions about what we're going to do before we jump in? You all clear what you're doing? Anybody unclear?
Is this to fill for our startup teams or our breakout room group?
I mean, you won't be with your team because the breakout's going to randomly assign you, so you can speak on behalf of yourself, or you know, and just assume that the people in your breakout are your team for today.
Okay.
But later you can do this. You can do this on your own with your team back at, you know, when you're back at work. Anybody else have any questions before we go? All right, here we go. So it looks like we're not in the session, so I don't know if you wanted to do this. If you can pause the recording if you'd like. Maha or Reem, I don't know. So, all right, thanks. So I think the other people will be coming in shortly. Did anybody have any comments or questions about the exercise? Were you able to do it, or was your group not talkative, or? Our group was a little untalkative. Were y'all able to do this? Was anybody want to, was it interesting or useful for you to?
Hello, Frank. Yes, it was fun. Actually, it was fun. We talked a little bit about few aspects of our startup and how we could make our idea more inclusive. I talked a bit about our startup. It's called Arabic. It's an e-learning tool to teach Arabic expats, kids, Arabic. So first of all, it was just for Lebanese, and then we pivoted a little bit to make it generic for Arabs, all Arabs, actually. That's because it was difficult for us at the beginning to grasp all the cultures of Arabic countries. You have 22 Arabic countries. And then we decided to include all Arab expats. Why not? Why not? But just start with few aspects of the culture. Make it a little bit like simple. And that was the solution. And now we're going into the implementation a little bit, like in 2 or 3 weeks, we hopefully on a platform, and then we'll see.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, you know, language is an interesting bias. The British were very skilled at using language to divide people, actually. And even within the UK, even within, your accent stops your opportunity. I realize it's the best form of colonization is language, because you can categorize and judge people by their the way they speak, or if they speak or don't speak. But but the the thing I think with familiarity with English versus the more ancient languages, right? Like Arabic seems like it's very close to the ancient language, is the familiarity with the script, like, my God, what's happening like here, with and I know like there's some very good, I would look at the Chinese language apps. There's some very they're even better than like Duolingo, like, which is an American kind of app. I think it's American, pretty sure it is. The famous one that was teaching language, but the Chinese apps are much better. They actually show you, visually show you, so that the visual part of it becomes part of it. And I think that's the thing, is like there's a couple of things, like when you're designing, like use the 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 strength of your own understanding of your language, which is, maybe that it's a visual language, but also don't take for granted the fact that people that come from like a English language, or German or French, or if they come from that kind of boring script, that it that they're able to more comfortably adopt, like be okay with the different. I think it's the biggest, for me, I would love to learn Arabic. I think I only know a few words of Arabic, but I should check out your app because I would love to learn Arabic. But I know I've heard a lot of people saying, oh, it's so it's so different. Anybody else have any comment before we move on here? We took actually double amount of time, so we should probably move on here. How to avoid bias, exclusion, and lost opportunities. There's an article written by Langdon Winter called "Do Artifacts Have Politics?" And the New York police force, like the policing, you probably heard of America's problem with shooting black people. Like the police, where I was living in Portland, we called it driving while black. Is if you were driving a car, it was a risk because you could be shot. I mean, it sounds like America sounds like South Africa in the 1980s, the apartheid, right? And in a lot of cases, it really is. But you don't think, when you think of New York, you don't think that. Anyway, there were these bridges that were designed, and these bridges were designed. Basically, poor people were riding the bus. Poor black people were riding the buses. They didn't own cars, private cars, and the bridges were built in the 60s so that the buses could not go under them. And the roads that these bridges go to the beach. So that's how you keep white people only going to the beach, because then the black people coming on the public bus couldn't come on this road to go to the beach. And like the point that he was making was that it doesn't matter what the artifact is, what the UI is, essentially what the design is, it's going to contain the decisions of the person that has it. But in this case, it's also going to contain the biases. And in this example, it was the society was deeply racist and segregated in the 1960s, like South Africa very much, and like Palestine and Israel today, like Gaza and Israel, deeply segregated. So it doesn't matter. It's not that if you're Israeli and you're designing something, like you're going to have that societal bias. You're going to say terrorism, security, put it over there, get it. You're not going to be able to have like I think, and I'm just saying this, like the bias, and I'm just using it as an example since we're in the region here. You're going to have a bias about security, and your security bias is going to be afraid of Arabs with bombs, and so forth and so on. So this is what we're talking about in terms of a similar type of thing. But even at the UI level, like, the shish kebab UI, like the three dots over here, the menu, this is called the shish kebab UI. Like, who decides what gets shish kebab? Like especially in a mobile app, or in a web app. Who decides what goes in there, and what stays on the screen to help the user, like this plus sign or the home or whatever, the tasks. when you take the topic of bias and there's, a famous example that was done here, like you type "why are black," and if you're using AI, the algorithm is going to reflect the biases of not just the society, but also of of the team that developed them. If you don't take an inclusive design perspective, those biases are going to creep in. They're going to sneak into the algorithm, and in terms of reflecting society, just because there's still racism, for example, just because there's still Black people being killed by the police in America every day now, it doesn't mean that that's the fact or that should be right. So really, what we're talking about with JEDI, with justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, we're not talking about just, it's not the kind of like, oh, well, we just want to include just to be nice. You want to just, for example, if I'm a man, I just want to be inclusive to a woman because I just want to be inclusive and nice. No, it's not about that. It's about saying the woman has a right because the woman has been left out of this design or this conversation. So get the woman back into it. It's about anti-racism and anti-sexism and anti-homophobia, anti-transphobia. It's about anti-ableism, with disability. It's about taking an actual position. This is what we're being advised by our colleagues now in Microsoft inclusive design. You can search Microsoft inclusive design to find inclusive design guidelines. Google inclusive design. There are a lot of efforts. Airbnb has one. I think Spotify has one as well. There are lots of inclusive design kind of toolkits. But even the transgender rights and the visibility of transgender individuals is new in the United States. And around this time period, 2015, is when transgender rights were starting to be introduced into like healthcare solutions and so forth and so on. The problem is if you leave people out, like the spacesuit, how many years do we have women since the 1990s, women have been flight commanders. They may have not done the space walks, right? Only 11% female at NASA anyway. There's something called gender signaling, which, it's the baby gets the blue and the boy gets the blue and the girl gets the pink, right? That, this is the type of bias that's maybe in the environment. Maybe you don't want to be biased, but the bias is there. And so you kind of just go along with it, for example, in the United States, you haven't been able to look at an Arab face on the TV without thinking it's a terrorist, because since 9/11, 2001, not 2011, since 2001, they've shown us faces of Arabs on TV as the bad guy, and so you have terrible Islamophobia in the United States that nobody talks about. And so there are many, if we fix the problem with shooting Black people in America, you still have to continue to open to justice to groups that are being left on the edges of conversations. Searching for beautiful women, this is just very recently, by the way, and Google knows this, but you'll see, okay, so there's a Black woman here, 2 Black women, mostly white women though. It depends on your browser too. When you use DuckDuckGo, you get different results. It's interesting. You type beautiful men, and this is in a US search, then it's mostly white men. I think all white men here. And that's the DuckDuckGo version again. So you can kind of see how the algorithm, by the way, we were doing some SEO, search engine optimization work with a disability group, and the algorithm it's bouncing, it's for SEO, so it's checking the web. The type of vulgar and violent and sexist and of disability, because we're working with a women's disability rights project. So we're trying to optimize the website, and the suggestions from the algorithm of this tool we're using, it's one of the best tools for SEO keywords. It's just, to me, it's just a reminder of, you know, just like this, that the bias is there. Uber provides a really nice example of what not to do, you know. So this was an example from, I think it was India, Wife Appreciation Day, you know, and Uber provided no cooking day, like a coupon. Well, this is deeply sexist, you know. I was helping some startups in Tunisia a few years ago after visiting an incubator there, and there's a Tunisian startup that had recipes, and they showed a picture on the website of a woman, like, you know, she was using the website, and I was thinking, I said to them, you know, the funny thing, of course, is that Tunisia, it was the women who started the revolution in Tunisia, so-called revolution. It was women's groups, and women's equality in Tunisia has improved under the new government since the revolution, some years, you know, a few years ago, right? But yet the stereotype of that was being perpetuated in this recipe site. And, you know, instead of like appealing, like why not encourage men to cook? Why not come at the value proposition as like, you know, get the recipe for your grandmother's best soup on our website, or that thing that you really love that your uncle or your aunt made for you, you know, when you were a child or whatever. Like, get that good recipe and share that, you know. It would have made more sense. You look at the timeline of Uber, and they were using the cameras, this God view they had, where they were tracking users, and okay, then now they ended up paying out tens of millions of dollars in lawsuits. But at the core of it, they said that the company was cultural shortcomings. That's funny. Was deeply sexist, that their culture was deeply sexist, you know, to the point where their CEO had to step down, if you recall this. There was a period where people were deleting the app. So millions of users deleted the app. Delete Uber is what it was called. And they actually helped the competitor. There's a competitor in the US, and they became really popular in 2019 in this period. And they were very low, and then they became almost half or more of the business. Again, Uber paying out hundreds of millions of dollars you know, for this. Now, we just heard a couple days last week that Tesla's self-driving car killed 2 people. It was Tesla's self-driving car. So the ethics of self-driving and robots need to be deeply ethical, removed of bias, but starting with the humans, right? Starting with bringing the human in the loop. With AI, there's something called human in the loop. Bring the human in the loop. Self-driving cars, whatever, robots, they need to have the human in. And so human-centered design is the umbrella methodology that we use. It's essentially a process for making design decisions based on involving users in the problem definition as you intentionally create the product or service, and then validate it with the user, validate your design concepts or your final. So, and I'm not talking about focus groups, and I'm not talking about surveys. Like I said earlier, those are market research techniques. We're talking about user testing, accessibility testing. We're talking about ethnography, culture study, living with users, hanging out with users, even just doing a 1 hour, 30-minute deep dive open interview. You can use something called a diary study, where you let the user report, you know, over a period of time, like a week or 2 weeks. But human-centered design is actually ISO standard. There's an ISO standard for this, and it's very clear that you build a product with the user needs, the context. Where are they using it? Why are they using it? You know, in what country, in what location, and what is their, you know, what do they bring to the design? What is their expectation, right? So user research, ethnography, participatory design is a technique. You may have heard of co-creation. And participatory design, where you include the users And then you can bring the users back in and show them your assumptions that you're building your design concept and get their feedback about it. So this is a Scandinavian technique that it starts to make more sense, especially when you're designing away from bias and including users. User testing, maybe some of you already do this or know of this. This is one user testing your product, going through tasks. It's not a focus group. It's not asking their opinion. It's having them actually use it as if it was real life. And then you get their feedback, and they're telling you what they would do as they go along. Accessibility is similar, but you're now testing with users with disabilities, and they're using what we call AT or assistive technology, like a screen reader if you're blind. iOS has a built-in screen reader. It's called VoiceOver, and in Android it's called TalkBack. And Google actually has a bunch of assistive technology tools. But UX process is where inclusion starts. I'm working with a couple of different organizations now. And what's interesting is they both think that the inclusion comes from the DEI, or the JEDI team, the diversity. So you have a diversity officer or an equity team in an organization. And yes, those people should be it, but inclusive design is everybody. Because UX is close to the user, you really need to leverage your UX teams to help you bring in that the needs and the pain points of those users. This is an example from a project that I've been working on. I was working, actually designed it last year, starting with doing research, interviews online, a diary study, and so this is the avatar selection. It's a healthcare product, actually. And so we created, these different, you can see all the different types of avatars that we've created, and try to remove anything, the violence, swords. This is for children. Trying to make sure, as well, in the experience we have African American voices. So we have like one of the sound effects goes, "Oh yeah," and then we also have some sounds of some different cultures. So just trying to make people feel comfortable with those sounds. And it's interesting when we tested it and we put in those sounds like, "Oh yeah," that it was interesting to kind of watch people. And actually we tested it with people of different races, mostly Black folks, and it was interesting to watch their reaction as well. So there's this concept of proximate, getting proximate to your users. What it means is getting close to them to understand their hopes and fears and their needs. It's where you build empathy, and then this leads to taking action. I said earlier, every time I do accessibility testing with a user or interview a user with a disability, I learn so much. Even though I've been doing this for many, many years, there's no depth to empathy, to really, really understanding. And empathy is one of these things. We all have it built into our brain, in the front of our brain. They're called mirror neurons, but there's also something called mentalizing. We think about other people. Right. The problem is if you do the mentalizing and you do the empathy without actually having the other person, right? Or you use a simulator, for example, if you put yourself in a wheelchair, or you pretend you're pregnant, or you pretend you're blind and you cover your eyes or something, these so-called disability simulators, there's been studies to show that pretending or not doing, not including users, not actually doing real empathy by just being with people, just sitting with them and listening to them, and not having an agenda, but actually asking them about their lives, asking them, how do they manage this? How do they do this? How do they, then that's how the empathy kicks in, and the understanding. It's like I was saying about that football pitch analogy, is like where you sit. It's how close you get. If you stay in your comfort zones, you're not going to end up with a good UX, because good UX comes from coming outside of your comfort zones to understand your users. And the question is, did you understand me when you, for example, conceived it? Right. So one of the things I realized from talking to some of the startups that maybe are joining today is that inclusion comes from the business model. Like, who are you targeting? Who's the audience? And, you know, are you thinking about the users when you designed it? Are you bringing, like, you can exclude people right at that early stage. You could also, if you just use focus groups or surveys, or you don't use proper interviewing techniques, like if you actually have an agenda and you're like, let me ask you about this, what do you think? And you use close-ended questions, you use the wrong methodology, if you will, you're going to get fuzzy data. You might not interpret it correctly because of your biases, maybe, because we all have biases, right? You're going to build that airbag for the car, which is based on a male body, or you're going to build that astronaut suit that's for men and doesn't fit a woman's body safely, right? And even when you, let's say you do bring users in to interview them, or, you know, when you ship it and you test it and you validate it, let's say you do bring those users in. When you recruit those users can be another point of exclusion. You know, so for example, you say, oh, we only want to talk to people who make this amount of money because they can afford the product. Other people can't afford the product. Don't do that. Remove that. I mean, obviously, you're not gonna sell your product to someone who's homeless if it's not for homeless people, right? If they're not included in that, if it's something that someone's buying, like a commercial product, you know, obviously. But just removing, we've noticed removing that criteria of a $50,000 is the cutoff in the U.S. 50,000 and below is considered a poverty indicator in the U.S. You basically can't live on that. You can't. It's very you know. And so when our clients say to us, you know, don't talk to people below that amount, we just remove that and just make sure they fit the behavior of what you're doing. You know, so that if they fit the behavior, then that's who you want to recruit. And of course, you want to make sure that you recruit from all groups. But you see, inclusion needs to start in the beginning when you're conceiving it even. The most strategic research you can do is ethnography to help you define the opportunity, to understand current behavior and habits, and use that, you know, and then bring your users in and then bring them test it at the end and make sure that it's being marketed to them and you're not leaving them out of the advertising, for example. You know, that you're not leaving your users out of the messaging. You're not just putting a white male middle class voice, you know, or something like that. And you've seen Silicon Valley struggle with this over the years with, you know, it's only in the last couple of years that smart speakers actually recognize a non-white male, you know, middle class accent, like Anglo accent in the US, which is shocking. There's so many, I mean, America's based on this idea of, you know, diversity and this idea of this melting pot and this idea of immigrants coming there, you know, from the colonial settler period. It's based on that promise, but you know, it's like the people designing this stuff have not stopped to think about it. It's like, oh, it works for me, you know. So this is one of the reasons why speech recognition has taken so long to kick off, is because you can't use it if you have an accent, you know. So inclusion first, inclusion up front. And if you don't intentionally and deliberately and proactively include people, you're going to unintentionally exclude them, as Joe Gernstedt said there. So acknowledging diversity and difference and putting people at the heart of the design process as per human-centered design ISO standard. By the way, there's a chat there on the WebEx that you can put questions, and we're going to go to question and answer shortly here. So let's talk about some practices. If you think about the business opportunity, and some of these are US centric, like Americans, like for example, increase in Black usage of mobile apps and Latinx usage of mobile apps. By the way, Latinx is the term given to in the community. You see, like Arabic, you have gender in your, you know, so male, masculine, right? So they say Latino, even if you're a woman, it should be Latina. And so they say the Latino community. And so this is the attempt to sort of remove the potential gender bias. That's what Latinx refers to, if you weren't aware of that. But if you look at the market here, LGBTQ market, in the US at least, the next billion users globally, 10 trillion in GDP. There's a lot of business opportunity there. But your whole team has to be on board, right? It's not just the diversity champion. It's not just the UX person that likes people and talks to users, the user researcher. It's not just one person, but everyone across how you're building and creating your products. Accessibility is really critical. You know, that I mentioned, you know, the stigma involved in it, in accessibility. This is why it's so difficult, because there's also the stereotype that it's just wheelchair and, you know, and so forth and so on. But accessibility needs to be built in throughout your process as well. Everyone involved understanding the basics, bringing users in early and throughout the process, and involving users in evaluating web accessibility. This is not trivial, by the way. There's an organization that approached me recently, which characterizes this. They're an e-commerce site, and they're being sued they sell their products in Spain and New York, in the US, and there's a New York lawyer who's suing them. The increase of accessibility lawsuits has gone up. They're being sued, and the reason they didn't want to work with my companies, they said they didn't want to include the users in accessibility. I had the same thing happen with a very large bank that said, yes, we want to do accessibility. It's actually important to us. We're doing an effort but we don't want to include the users. This is an IT project. This is a serious project. We're not going to spend time talking to users. Just completely unbelievable. And I have another 3 or 4 examples. This is recently. You would think it would be like from 20 years ago or something, or 10 years ago. This is just in the last 6 months. I have maybe 4 or 5 examples. The reason they cited that they don't want to do the project is because they don't want to include users. Unbelievable. So inclusion starts with including users and getting human-centered design or user-centered design into your process. If you're doing accessibility, you need to manage it as a program. Build out components and libraries and accessibility test cases. And it's at design, at dev, and post-launch maintenance and updating as well. This is inclusive design. This is Kat Holmes, who is at Microsoft. She's at Google now. You can download her toolkit if you type Kat Holmes Inclusive Toolkit, and this is her book, Mismatch. She basically says that all disability or all lack of accessible technology is just a mismatch with that user's need. So it's a different way of thinking about it. You remember the Zoom bombing last year well, that was a privacy issue. So there's privacy by design principles. Privacy is so important, especially in the United States with users. This is an app on the right here called Jumbo Privacy. And it actually locks down your Facebook and puts the data on your phone, for example. But you can use best practices like the privacy by design to embed privacy up front throughout your process and as a default. So just like inclusion design, it should be a default. VR can also be a source of vulnerability for not just bias, because the bias, the shortcut, by the way, with VR, the bias there is that it's like perceived as a gaming thing, and there's so much more opportunity to go beyond the gaming frame with VR. Well, gaming automatically means male. It means like young male between the age of 12 and 30. That's what the bias in the immersive technology AR and VR is. But this is the biometric data that a university discovered could be identified from just looking at 5 minutes of motion data from a VR session. Privacy again, you saw the privacy issues with the COVID apps as well, and countries that have pulled back from doing tracking there. We're in this very precarious time with technology where our privacy may be violated. And, just imagine if you're traveling to the United States and you're Arab and you're being profiled because there's a policy to profile Arabs. That's a legacy of 9/11, and you're being discriminated against. It's just because the AI camera has got you on the list, Very real threat. This is hilarious because this is a Google developer. He says, I thought I had location tracking turned off. So our messaging around this is enough to confuse the privacy-focused Google software engineer. He said that's not good. He's actually realizing that, even the people who make the software are confused by this. There's dark patterns, so-called dark patterns. And by the way, I mentioned colonialism, and a lot of our problems with race and exclusion and out-group, in-group come from our recent colonial period. And the fact that people have not come to terms with that history. But yes, we call minority, even though minorities are the world's population. In the US, we call minorities people that are not white. I have a sticker on my refrigerator that says, why are minorities, since they're the majority, why are they called minority in the world, And the reason is because we take an ethnocentric point of view. In America, we just talk about America and we say, oh, you're a minority because, I grew up in Minnesota and mostly it was Scandinavian settlers that populated Minnesota. And then we started getting different groups of people coming for work. Dark patterns with UIs have been studied in e-commerce. E-commerce is full of dark patterns. This is a big area. I think the state of California is legislating against dark patterns. Also, the Federal Trade Commission, the federal government in the US, has a dark pattern reporting. You can report a dark pattern. Dark pattern is deliberately using bias or using error or tricking you in order to basically get you to sign up or get your money or do something worse, manipulate you. And it's very important that you don't accidentally do a dark pattern, or that you don't, do something close to a dark pattern. Dark pattern is usually a deliberate one. So decolonizing design is a focus that people are starting to talk about. So instead of decolonizing design means instead of taking an expert role, with your design, that you bring the community in, that you remove the bias that you have a product and a team, and that you're, that you have these users and best and better than them. And so if you're doing UX research, you're connecting with the communities, bringing the representation, bringing diversity onto your team, into your, so you have so you're proximate with your users, so you can be close to them. But also, if you have diversity within your team, you can use that to test. You can ask your team members to help you detect bias that you might not see because you're so used to where you're coming from. We become more facilitators. The great grandfather of human-centered design is advocating also this role, that what I call community-centered design. You can also conduct a ethical UX audit or an abusability test. It's a new thing called abusability. Basically, try and break it for bias, try and tear it apart. And I mentioned localization. That taking a localization type of approach to, in other words, culture study, your users or cultural group, find out if you are selling your product to other countries, even in your region. Saudi Arabia, very different from Lebanon, Egypt, Israel, Turkey, and so forth, very different culturally. So just because you're in the Middle East, don't assume that you understand those other adjacent countries. Or if you're selling into Europe, even Southern Europe is different from Northern Europe. Even Italy, Southern Italy, very different. We did some research in Italy, and we actually did the research in Milan, but we consulted a subject matter expert who told us that Southern Italy is very different from Northern Italy. So we are bearing that in mind, that cultural difference within the country. So a lot of talk about MVPs, like minimal viable product, right? But one of the biases that's the most dangerous is confirmation bias. It's basically we see what we think we want to see. You remember when George Bush and Dick Cheney and so forth were selling us those wars, that they would say, oh, Saddam Hussein has the weapons of mass destruction. And everybody knew it was a lie. But then they would produce the data to show you that it was they would decide before they had the data, before they, and you see this type of stupidity in politics, right? Says Iran is the threat. They have the bombs. No, wait, no, they don't have bombs. Oh, okay. Oh well, no, they do. The thing is, that sounds stupid for people like Tony Blair, George Bush, or whoever, like Trump, whoever it may have been in the past in American foreign policy. But we do the same thing with our products. We do the exact same thing with our products. We make those stupid assumptions based on what we think our users are going to do or what they want, and so it's very important that you include user research and ground your MVP in your user research. So that comes to the conclusion of our session. And I think you can go to Slido, and if you want to go to Slido, let's go to questions here while I put up a Slido for you. Maha, are you there? Still there with us?
Yes, I'm here.
I'm here.
Yeah.
I'm
All right.
okay.
Did you want
Yes,
to?
I'm here.
Did you want to say anything? And can we go to question time now? Do we still have a few minutes to?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I don't see any questions on the Google Doc, Reem. So I'm guessing I should just go to the chat.
There are questions in the chat box, so if
Oh, okay.
you can redirect them to the slido.com. They can ask their questions there.
Okay, yeah, sure. So on Slido, there's a poll. I think there's a poll up there now, but there's also an audience Q&A. Do you see that?
Yes.
So go ahead, and if you have some questions there, or you can also open your mic and just ask the question verbally if you want, if you'd like. If you don't want to type.
Can I ask something that's not like directly related to the whole startup thing?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so like most of the time when we talk about bias, we're thinking like men against women, right? Or I don't know, white against black, let's say. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So but I'm noticing something in the US or like in the English speaking countries,
Mm-hmm.
because like I'm somebody who watches a lot of crime shows.
Mm-hmm.
So like you won't believe the times I watched a crime or a crime show talking about a crime where like the man killed the woman because they wanted to get a divorce and he was afraid that she was gonna take the kids, for example. So this is something that I've noticed many times, is that the law there says that if a divorce takes place, like the woman or the wife, the mother gets the kids, and the man will have supervised the visits, or she that she doesn't want to let him get to know the kids anymore. And
Mm-hmm.
I think this is unfair, in all honesty. Like, why isn't this addressed if we are like in a time where we are addressing all the issues of unfairness or injustice? I feel like this is something that was like implemented in, I don't know when, the 1800s, and it's still going until now. Like, in Lebanon, it's the other way around. If a divorce takes place, the man gets the kids, and the woman will have to fight to see her kids. But like, I'm talking about the US because they are addressing these issues of injustice. I feel like this is, I don't know, this is unfair in my opinion. Like, why do we have to say, oh no, the mother is much better than the father, and she gets to decide if he can see them, etc., etc. So this is something I don't know why nobody is addressing it.
Yeah, I mean, there is there's it depends country by country, by the way. I'm in Scotland, and in Scotland the law gives the right to the woman even if the man is not, even if the woman is not right. So the law actually biases. And it's interesting in policing in Scotland that there's anti-racism built into so we've been talking today a lot about anti-racism approach to design and anti-sexism and anti-homophobia and so forth, anti-ableism for disability. In the policing in Scotland, they actually I'm just amazed. There's anti-racism in the sense that if you say anything or do anything that is Islamophobic, in particular, they're very sensitive to crimes against Muslims because of the years of Tony Blair and the Islamophobia that came from those Bush Blair years. It left such a scar on the U.S. and the U.K. And then they have the stupid Brexit, which is just a big racist experiment, was the reason. But yeah, it's fascinating to me. Like they swoop down and the police will put you in jail if you say you say anything or do anything that is now because the reason that's fascinating for me is because in the United States, quite the opposite. If you're racist or if you're racist against somebody in the United States, that it's the opposite. They're like, good job, you did that. So I'm kind of being funny, but in other words, there's no anti-racism. The police are the problem in the United States with regard. So up to the criminal justice system, you have institutionalized racism. What you're talking about is just a symptom of institutionalized racism or institutionalized sexism. I said in the beginning, the United States doesn't have gender equality on the books. Actually, very few countries do. I think there's only 6 countries in the world that have actual gender equality, like legislated 100%. Most of them are in the Scandinavian countries. If you're on the films on the Netflix or whatever, there's a great film called Mrs. America, which is about America's almost attempt for putting a gender equality. And it was killed off by the Christian fundamentalists, essentially killed that. And then Ronald Reagan came into power, and he was this ideological, crazy, guy. Yeah, I mean, that's all I can say about that. It's just a reflection of the society. Every society is different, and it's going to change, and it will change. One of the gifts that Donald Trump gave us was that he showed us that women have rights because of his horrible sexist and misogynist behavior. He elevated, do you remember the whole Me Too thing and the whole new focus on women's rights comes from thank you to Donald Trump. Also, the racism that he tried to use the racism that was in the American culture. He tried to make it like a powerful force, and it was crushed and defeated. This year in January, the FBI was rounding up all these people and locking them all up, the people that stormed the White House. And it's to be an extremist now in America is illegal. It's like when under Donald Trump, it was not. So it's a period of transition. I think the thing with technology, to bring it back to products and services and experiences that you might be designing, is that you can't wait for your society to, so you have to, or you can't wait for society in general, whatever. You have to find where those weaknesses are in your strategy and your product strategy, which means that if your product strategy is not looking out for bias and not looking out for inclusion, those biases are going to creep in, especially, I think, because America's not the best example. We always look to America for the best example, right? Because the computers came from there. My God, like Apple Computer, Microsoft, Google, like these big successes came from there. Silicon Valley gave us the whole app economy and creating things by apps and all this. But the US hasn't been the best, like a shining example. If you want the shining example, it's always in Finland, Sweden, Norway, so forth, right? Because those societies have a sense of social democracy, if you will. They have a sense of fairness and regulation and societal. They balance money with societal good. In the United States, the entire culture has been only focused on money, and the greed has taken over. that's falling apart. And now the focus in the United States is coming back to, thank God, it's coming back to this is the better good of society, right? And that includes the environment. It includes sustainability, because there's a link between all these issues of the social fabric and the environmental fabric, if you will, our planetary resources and harmony with the planet. So now we're coming back to that. So this is a great opportunity to, understand inclusive design and start to bake it in and bring it into your products and your strategy. It's actually what's happening now in the new Silicon Valley. If you were to study, like everything that you're thinking and doing now is a hangover from Silicon Valley from 5 or 10 years ago, guaranteed. In other words, you have a bias. You have a bias about American culture and about Silicon Valley, and it's 5 or 10 years old. But if you were to clean the slate, if you were to wipe away everything you know about America and everything you know about Silicon Valley, today, the new picture in Silicon Valley is about inclusive design. And I'm talking like at the big corporate level, and also the startups that will be funded by venture capitalists. They won't be tolerating and allowing the old school business. There's been a very, very radical shift in American society. Thank God for the better, But we continue to grow. It's not like a magic wand. It's a continuous process of getting to that justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. That is that should be the default, instead of the extra thing. So that's the challenge, I think, for you all, is like how to make this your default, how to bring users into your process, because maybe unless you studied UX, you leave the users out, or you talk to a couple friends, or you decide because you use traditional marketing, you got an MBA degree, use MBA, and you have to bring in social entrepreneurship with a non-colonial, with a non-Western bias, with a non-American bias, because that old system and those old processes are not where the innovation is. And if you don't realize that, in 5 or 10 or 15 years, you'll wake up and you'll start seeing these defaults, and you'll be like, I could have been I could have done that with my product or with my design, or because it's happening right now. And it's so good because we have resources. We have resources from Microsoft and Google on inclusive design. There's some incredible work being done right now in the United States, but I think it's a little bit quiet and it's very new, and maybe it's even the reason why we're having this talk now, What other questions or comments?
Are there any questions?
Slido for you. See it?
Is one on Slido? Let me bring it up. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just looking at the WebEx here. Oh yeah, so there's one question. Should we conduct ethnographic studies in each market we want to target to be inclusive? Or is there a universal standard of inclusivity we can follow? Yeah, unfortunately, you can't, there isn't, you can't, I think maybe so yes, you do need to include it in each audience, in each segment that you want to be inclusive, that you want to understand. And what you can do though is you can, because of the overlap, just like that exercise you did with your own background, and the point of that was to expose to your team, and these were your team here if you were talking, that where you come from, what your biases are, to put that out on the table, and so that you can say, oh, we don't know anything about gay people, we don't know anything about trans people, or gender non-conforming people. You heard of GNC, gender non-conforming? What is that? What is that? I don't know what that is. So then, because I don't know what that is, I want to make sure that I include that community. One way that you can start with that is actually by reaching out to community groups and community organizations. Those organizations will help you get access to your users and also help you understand the population. You can also use subject matter experts, SMEs. Subject matter experts, or so-called SMEs, are people who really, really understand that particular audience. You know, for example, there's a guy who runs a startup incubator in Tunis, and he worked in the digital inclusion group for the government, and he has a really strong understanding of digital inclusion. You know, he's like a SME because he's worked in different countries. He did it in I lived abroad and came back to Tunis basically. And so using subject matter experts is a really good thing. The last thing I would suggest on that is you may have heard of this concept of intersectionality, like the overlap. So you have someone who's poor and someone who's gay, or you have someone who's you know, who's Black and also Jewish and also Arab, and grew up with that perspective, with a mixed perspective, a mixed race, mixed heritage, mixed culture, or you have yeah, but you know, I just want to say the main thing you'll have to do is include the different groups. It just means more work, basically more work and more time, but it's worth the payoff. You know, it's worth the payoff just from if you're truly interested in innovation, the link to inclusion and innovation is very clear. Wasn't always seen that way. It was all seen like as, oh, I don't want to, you know, we don't need to talk to. Hangover of empire is, I think we're kind of like waking up from this idea that like, oh, we could just ignore people. And you know, even Charles Darwin in Science, his ideas were manipulated in the 1880s, and he wasn't selling his book, and so on the front of the book they called it they put a subtitle of why white people are the supreme dominators of the earth, or why they're justified. And they'd use the biological theory of what they observed of competition. We now know, actually, from putting cameras, webcams out in the forest and in wild open spaces, that animals actually cooperate. They cooperate together. So cooperation is actually, it's not survival of the fittest was manipulated as a term because in that colonial period, the end of the British Empire, they needed those ideas, you know, so we're kind of deconditioning ourselves from those. You'll see, though, if you do localization work, that even there's a cross-cultural scale that was done by an IBM guy in the early 80s. And it's just, it's not complete. You know, you need to take a post-colonial perspective, you know, when you study culture. You can't ignore the history of a place. I think your challenge, though, like from a Beirut perspective, is like innovating and designing, like not from an outside, not from looking like, oh, this is how we would do things in Silicon Valley, this is how we'll do it too, but really trying to understand your organic culture, your Beirut, you know, your Lebanon, you know, like because of the unique cultural conditions, the unique history, the unique population and religions and situation of those unique conditions, to really bring those into your product strategy, as opposed to having this, you know, incubator, elitist, you know, academic, like, you know, connected to the West. We just fly out to Paris when the flights will allow, or fly out to Los Angeles or New York and have this connection to abroad. And but to really connect with your local community and to find out what the unmet and underrepresented needs are there. That I think is the biggest opportunity and challenge. So a few more questions and then we can wrap up maybe. So at what stage of a startup should we consider inclusive design? At the beginning, even when you decide on the business model, right? That's where it starts, because that's where your assumptions creep in. The biggest problem in design and the biggest problem with teams is assumption. The more you can kill assumptions, and what do you do instead? You validate with actual data. You bring in real user behaviors. We observe the users, you know, doing this, doing that. We observe their limitations, their habits, their weak spots. This is the basis of ethnography and human-centered design. Does the idea prototype have to be inclusive? You want to test people when you're prototyping, yes, with underrepresented users. So yes, the prototype has to be inclusive. The business model, the user research, doing the design, testing it, and marketing it has to be inclusive. This is what Google suggests, actually. And one of my favorite books is called Building for Everyone. It's a book that came out last year. And you'll see in that book, it's about Google's product inclusion strategy and how they do it, how they built it, and how they refined it. And that's what they suggest as well, which is absolutely right. It says, if I'm required by law, if I'm targeting international markets, is it required by law if I'm targeting international markets? Yes, and it will be required by sales opportunities that you have. You know, so for example, if you're designing something that's not sustainable, good luck trying to sell it in Europe, because Europe invested last year. I don't know if you noticed, but it was a very small footnote that it just sort of, I had to go look for it. No one mentioned it. Europe has invested 2.5 trillion euros in the green economy, which means the laws are going to, I think they're phasing out I think it's this year. From this year, you won't be able to buy a car that has a regular engine. Like it has to be hybrid or electric. So you're going to start seeing the laws change. So yes, if you try and sell inside of a market that has an inclusive or sustainable strategy, good luck. You know, you'll have to backwards retrofit your product. It's also much more difficult to try and fit your product to the users or to users that you left out. For example, if you put out a racist camera or racist algorithm or a sexist spacesuit or a sexist set of airbags for a car or whatever, right? Fill in the blank. If you accidentally project your biases into your design because you didn't use an inclusive design process, it's not going to be, you know, big. You have big problems. Specifically like disability. It's like the Spanish company that I told you about that was being sued in New York. And they said, oh, we don't want to test, we don't want to accessibility test with users. It was only proposing only 5 users. I said, no, that's too much. Which to me is like, that's like a gambler. To me, I'm like, wow, good luck to you, because you're too much of a gambler. If you don't want to test with 5 users, my God. You just want to, you know, take your chances and be sued. Okay. That just seems like a definition of stupidity to me, right? Somebody says, what if I miss inclusion on the design phase? And is it too expensive to redo the platform? It's talking about a platform. Yeah, it can be. I mean, a lot of people are in this situation now where they have a product and they're trying to figure out how to make it more inclusive. So it might not be the case where you wave a magic wand, but that you roadmap it and you start to include inclusion in your roadmap as you move forward. You know, that unless you have something that is, you know, has turned into a public relations disaster. Like, for example, do you remember Microsoft's chat bot on, was an AI bot on Twitter? And some people sent these racist messages to it, and it and then it started learning the racism because it had a machine learning component to it, and then it started saying racist things, and they had to shut it off. I gave an example in the webinar about Uber. You know, you can damage your company, your brand, and your trust with your users if it gets to the stage where there's if you missed it at the design phase. So it's better to get it at the design phase, and even earlier than the design phase, the ideation, requirements, concept, you know, the business requirements. One of the things that Intel had a very mature human-centered design climate, and I worked there in the early 2000s for quite a few years, and I was very impressed with a very mature UX culture there. But one of the things, they had a group that was called People and Practices, and it was led by this Australian anthropologist. Her name is Genevieve Bell, and she actually has she's back in Australia. She left Intel after like 25 years or something, 30 years, I don't know, a long time. She went back to Australia, and she does a lot with AI and ethics now. She has some really, really great she at Intel, what she did is she moved the ethnography to before the product life cycle, before when the business requirements are being defined. So she had her teams going around the world investigating user behavior and culture and opportunities, and then brought that back into the product development lifecycle. So that's the most strategic use of upfront user research during the design process, yes, and then the testing process, and then also the marketing as well, so that your marketing is inclusive as well. So this looks like all the questions on Slido. Thank you so much all for your participation and for your attention. Maha, did you want to say anything here as we wrap up?
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for giving us your time and for the very, very useful info. Well, my takeaways was that for IPARC startups, consider inclusion in the design phase, please. Remedy would be much, much harder than design phase. And if you are planning to grow and go international, well, you have to do it anyway. So start with it now, right, Frank?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I also been impressed with what I've seen from iPark with the sustainability and the focus there on social entrepreneurship as well. You know, and so yeah, I think the only things that I when I was talking to some of the startups is maybe we call it academic bias. Take your product to the street. Don't be afraid of the street. Take your product to the street. You know, make it real. Ground it in the opportunities that are on the street. Don't assume that you're, you know, like wearing white gloves and you're catering to that your customer is the person with a fur coat that's driving the Mercedes, and don't assume that you're building for this like upper middle class like consumer who can only buy your product. You know, look for opportunities cross-governmentally, look for opportunities, you know, by reaching into some of these underrepresented groups, even women. You know, there's one of the startups I talked to that has a picture of a woman or a girl on the front of the website, but the product doesn't really have anything special for girls, even though it's around mathematics. And I'm like, well, you know, my God, if you have something here, and you know, are you kidding me? We have a chance to empower girls and women. So use the diversity, the difference, use it as your business leverage as well to target different groups and to empower them and you know, make them your MVP on an inclusive group, instead of the stereotype of you know, the rich white man who has lots of money and has this army of slaves and requires a special lifestyle. That's definitely no longer the case. And like my friends in Tunisia that were making the cooking recipes, I like to cook, so I was a little bit offended myself. But another funny one was another startup. They wanted to offer their service by mobile payment. The problem in Tunisia is the government won't even allow you to exchange money like a PayPal or to give someone else money. The banking system is like stuck in Tunisia. So nobody uses mobile payment in Tunisia. So this startup, it's a Tunisian startup, proposing to use mobile pay. I don't know. They're looking at Europe. They're looking at France. They're looking at Paris. They're like, well, I buy my stuff in Paris. And so they're looking at that side of Tunisian culture that is like a neighborhood of Paris. Tunis and Paris are like, you know, a neighborhood connected, you know. But if you're in Tunis and all you're doing is bringing Parisian culture, or the fact that you can transact and you can do mobile payment and you can get your Amazon or your parcels, but you can't do it during the rest of then you're missing, you're missing. And this was the problem I realized when I went to Tunis to study the culture, to Tunisia. They were spending too much time on Facebook. Their revolution, and actually they told us that the people, when we interviewed people, they said Tunisians only know how to use social media. They don't know how to use the internet to research. So, social media and Facebook are not the place to start democracy, and not the place to, and as we saw in Tunisia. But yeah, I think it's the big, because I'm Greek, and I see a similar thing with Greece. In Greece, the historical colonial relationship is with Germany. So in Greece, everything they look to Germany. In fact, Greece is celebrating its independence this year. It's 1820, I think it was. So 200-year independence, is it? They also were given their independence by the Germans, and the Axis powers. They didn't really take their independence. So Greece, they don't really talk about it. They're not comfortable, discussing that. But if you go to buy coffee in Greece, the best coffee is really bad German coffee, and it's like overpriced, but it's like bad. And it's because the perception of the market is it's German, so it must be good. And it's not that everybody looks to Germany for like the solution, but I think there's, if you're a country that had a strange independence like Greece did, and also was like a slave to the European Union, like Greece has been, there's a challenge there to have almost like their national pride to innovate within your own conditions. Go outside and learn from outside. Go to America, get your MBA degree, get the ideas from Silicon Valley, but now try and design the challenges that you think you're beyond that because you learn. No, come back to the motherland and design within the constraints of your street, and or at least from that point of view, and you'll actually have a more inclusive outcome, I think, because it's the toughest thing to do. It's easier to just get on a plane and fly to London or to fly to New York, and it's more difficult to sort of deal with the constraints, whatever they are, political, economic, or technological, or whatever. So thanks again so much. Just shukran.
Thank you so much, Frank.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for sticking with us half an hour more than planned.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. See you soon.
Take care. Bye for now.
Thank
Thank
you,
you. Take
everyone.
care.
Have a pleasant evening. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.